Resistance Spirit today. This is one of our exciting and most creative shows in 2021. My name is Mandata Mlojo. I am your host and I'm co-hosting with Adiola Fayahan. Adiola, it's great to share the platform with you again. So basically, the Resistance Bureau convenes leading voices around issues of democracy, human rights, and the struggle for freedom in Africa. Part of what we try to do is to spotlight some that they're at the forefront of this critical and ongoing fights in the continent. So in that spirit, and against the backdrop of our topic today, the art of resistance, we've brought together leading artists from different genres to come together and have a conversation about really the place and the power of art in resistance. So I'd like to welcome to the show today, Godfrey, popularly known as Gado, a Tanzanian often mistaken for a Kenyan because that is the base. That is where he is based. He's one of Africa's best known animators and TV producers. We also have Lebogang Mashile, a fiercely talented poet, author, and actress from South Africa, was performed in 28 countries. We also have on the platform DJ Switch, an award-winning Nigerian musician and producer who's leveraged their social media platforms to build international attention on issues of violence against peaceful protesters, most notably as part of the EndSARS movement. We have also Farai Monroe, popularly known as Comrade Fazo, a trailblazing political satirist and social justice activist from Zimbabwe, who works at the critical juncture of the arts, activism, and innovation. Also joining us as discussants today are Sue Williamson, a writer and an author based in South Africa, whose work often reflects on themes of memory and identity. And our very own Nick Chisman. Ladies, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to host you today. Welcome to the show. So for those that are more interested in the biographical details of our speakers today, please visit our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, where you can also watch our past episodes, also learn about our mission, our guiding principles, and some of the ideas and exciting plans that we have going forward. But also you can keep track of today's discussion on Twitter by following @ResistBureau, as well as using the hashtag ResistBureauLive. We're presently live streaming on Facebook and on YouTube, and this show is being recorded for later distribution. So I'm just going to hand over to my co-host Adiola to give a brief introduction of today's topic. So Adiola, please take over.
Thank you so much, Mantate. Once again, yes, my name is Adiola Fayon, and I'm so excited to be co-hosting this show today. As you guys are aware, art is inseparable from politics. On one end, we have painters, singers, poets, writers, satirists who have expertly used artistic platforms to expose hypocrisy and abuse while also responding to repression and human suffering in their different societies. In so many African countries, for example, art has evolved into a social and creative movement that communicates key messages in the public arena, and creative movement that communicates key messages in the public arena and that are accessible to all. In this way, art can be both a powerful instrument for advocacy and an essential element for reflections on human existence. Now, on one hand, however, governments often seem to want artists to sanitize their image. Somebody, they want them to sanitize their regimes. They want artists to make them look good even if they're not doing well. And so there are still a lot of artists in Africa who don't question authorities. And they're actually, in fact, the ones singing the praises of authoritarians and helping them to clean up their image. So many artists across the continent have made a living by attending the events of rich politicians. We all know that. And so it's really hard for those kind of artists to speak up, which is why we have huge respect for all the guests on the show today, because they are speaking out against injustice. But they are now being affected. A lot of people that are not speaking out are now being affected by the situation in their countries. And we're now seeing a new trend. Both young and old are now using their artistic platforms to express and speak their truth to those in power. So how can we learn from artists about how to prevent co-optation and promote resistance? You know, in recent years, celebrities in countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, they're speaking out against the government and participating in protest, something that was not done years ago. For example, during the Lekki Gate and the EndSARS protest in Nigeria, Davido and Wizkid were both present at the protest. And actually, because of them and their influence, so many protesters were released at that time. AKA Ice Cube made bold statements in the Zimbabwean Lives Matter campaign as well. And we also can look at historical experiences, including the protest songs that were circulated on illegal cassettes during the Moi dictatorship in Kenya. I don't know why they call them illegal cassettes, but hey. And also the powerful critiques of authoritarian leaders by Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, and the political cartoons and protest graffiti that are popular in countless countries, from South Africa to Ghana. And let's not forget Fela Anikulapo Kuti of Nigeria. People are still singing his songs still today because the things he sang about at that time are still as relevant today. So in our discussion today, we seek to learn from artists, from their experiences, their opinions, including the perspective of academics, the place and power of art in resistance on the African continent. We want to explore the history of art as resistance leading up to today and its different manifestations. Most importantly, our assembled speakers of today will identify how art is being used and interpreted at different levels of society to spotlight injustice and to provide pointers to patterns of development that warrant resistance in today's world. So, as the audience, we're so glad to have you guys. Please make sure that you send us your questions through our WhatsApp number. The number is on the screen and it's +263 77623 8199. Mantati, please bring our guests into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Adiola. So I'm going to jump straight in and call Comrade Fato into the conversation. So you'd agree with me that art is a broad concept and so is its impact. So to set the foundation for today's discussion, I would like for you to come in and give our audience a sense of recent developments in art on the continent, particularly looking at the nature of art that is being employed in resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think Adiola touched on it really well. Like this, it's not something new. We've got a history of art as resistance, as activism on the continent, and that's through the apartheid struggle with the use of song, with the likes of Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela, through the Chimurenga in Zimbabwe with the likes of Thomas Mapfumo, and of course, as Adiola mentioned, the likes of Fela Kuti using music as a tool for struggle. I think bringing it up to the present day, I think you've got a new generation that are using many different tools that are at their hands, from digital media all the way through to arts, as a form of resistance and as a form of speaking out against the real kind of shrinking space that we see on the continent. And I think there's some really amazing examples of this. I think of course you see quite well-known examples, the likes of someone like Bobby Wine as a young, youthful artist who uses his music to mobilize young people and then builds that into a career in politics, which is really, I think, bringing about a lot of youth mobilization in Uganda. I think also what's interesting to look at is how young people are also using other forms of art. So not just music, but also satire, like political satire, which I'm very passionate about. So you look at the likes of those we have on the show, like Gado, who's an inspiration. He's my elder, my inspirational Tanzanian grandfather. I shouldn't reveal his age. But people like Gado who use satire to speak truth to power, and a younger generation, let's say in Zambia, you look at Pilato, a satirist there who uses hip hop, who uses comedy as a means to poke fun at the regime in Zambia. So I think looking at it is definitely a really interesting pattern of art being used for resistance right now on the continent.
So I just have a follow-up question for you. I just wanted to say that you are using art for activism, and you're combining that with innovation as the co-founder of a leading creative media organization that works at the critical junction of the art. And we're seeing a trend in Africa, actually, like Power 254 in Kenya, Connected Development, we call them CODE in Nigeria, Wizards Foundation in Uganda, Bloggers of Zambia, and so on and so forth. So all this represent arts in an institutionalized sense. But the main question is, how are you guys using this as a tool of resistance? And also, how's your security like, the security of the artists that are speaking truth to power?
Yeah, a good question. So, I mean, with the organization that I co-founded with my co-founder Outspoken, we set up Magamba Network back in 2007, and Magamba in Shona, which is one of the majority languages in Zimbabwe, it means freedom fighters. We were trying to reclaim the language of the struggle from our ruling elite and bring it, forward for the next generation. And we're all about using creative forms of activism to reach out to young people and get them involved in trying to be part of the positive change that our country desperately needs. So we started off back in 2007 using hip hop and spoken word, organizing big kind of hip hop events that were real spaces for free expression in a country with very little free expression. And over the years, we've just started innovating and using different forms of popular youth culture and popular urban culture as part of our kind of activism at Magamba. So we branched out into political satire, into blogging, into festivals, into running creative hubs and co-working spaces. But all of this is very much focused on trying to use creative means to communicate to young people and get them involved in the struggle for change in Zimbabwe. In terms of how it affects our safety, well, that's the problem, because we produce, political satire shows. Like we produce a popular weekly political satire show called The Week. It reaches, hundreds of thousands of young viewers in Zimbabwe. It's been featured on BBC, CNN, The Guardian, etc. But it also gets watched a lot by our state security services. So, we have had clampdowns. 2017 is a good example of it, where they tried to demolish our creative hub. They threatened to not allow us to have our festival because we had a comedian at the festival the previous year saying Zimbabwe's not ready for its own currency because we don't have a dead president to put on it yet. This was while Mugabe was still alive. So the police threatened to shut down the festival, saying you're trying to assassinate the president. And we said, no, it's comedy. And then by the end of the year in 2017, they had arrested our Magamba TV producer, who was producing all our political satire shows. They arrested her, threw her in maximum security prison, accusing her of trying to overthrow the government. They then raided our offices, confiscated our laptops. And we woke up the next day in safe houses, wondering what to do next, only to see generals on TV saying, this is not a coup, this is a military assisted transition. And we realized we'd been saved by the coup. So the charges from yesterday about us trying to overthrow the government, luckily the military had beaten us to it. They overthrew them first. So.
Wow. I'm sure everybody on this panel can share similar experience. But, moving on to Gado, and I'm sure you've had similar experience like Comrade has had. I'm sure that you've also paid the price, Gado, and I'm sure that the government doesn't like you very much. But like I said earlier, there are some artists who are helping to paint the image of the government in a nice way. For example, we've seen something like that, like the visit by Kanye West to Uganda, and also the Plan MTV Africa Music Award in the past, but also like Akon being in the country right now. So I'm just wondering if you were to talk to artists who are singing the praises of politicians, I'm imagining that it's lonely up there where you are, because you are speaking against the government, so to say. So, but if you were to speak to artists who are singing the praises of the government, what would you say to them? Gado.
I think, yeah. I'm here. Thanks for having me. I hadn't unmuted my mic. First of all, I think I would like to, pay tribute to Fela. He's my inspiration as growing up also. And I look at what he did in the 70s, standing up to the military in Nigeria. It's like fiction. And so I'm always reminded of artists like Fela whenever I'm in trouble. Second is that there is a famous quote, which says, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. I think often attributed to Jefferson, but as I know, but I think it is quite a very, one might say, a perfect quote for this forum. One of the things that one has to also be aware of is that politicians actually they are always constant working, and one of the things that they found it pretty much working for them is actually to work with artists. So one of the things is that they've always tried to because they know the power of art. Artivism, as we call it, didn't start today, and I think probably that's something that was coined recently. But throughout history, we've seen actually, as you and Comrade Fatso put it, that we've seen a history of artists resisting. And so one of the things that you have seen that throughout history is that politicians have been very clever, co-opting artists into their cause. I mean, in Africa, you have a history with Mobutu, who was actually, for lack of a better phrase, you might call him an original gangster. He, used to buy artists, and they would sing his praises. And as I say that, if you are an independent artist, yes, it is a very difficult scenario when you're up there. I think one of the things that I must add is that I was fairly lucky to work at a very independent newspaper, and I was very independent, and that was very helpful. And I, from a very early age in my career, I worked very independently, and that pretty much put me in that course that to become an independent artist. Now, it is very difficult for artists who are struggling, and I can imagine today, for young artists, it's a very difficult ballgame. Yes, we have internet, we have social media platforms, but also artists have to eat, they have to pay rent, and so there is always that it's very difficult for young artists who are trying to make their ends meet to really actually confront some of these issues. If you were to, I talked earlier, I think, about how clever politicians are. I mean, look at what Museveni has been doing. He has always known that, to get the youth vote is that, you have to be seen to be part of the youth. And what he has always done, he has always, organized all these concerts and events, which actually they would seem, to promote the youth agenda, but far from it. Actually, they are contrary to what is happening in Uganda, and the recent situation, I think, is pretty sad. What is happening with Akon. I can understand for some of these artists, and obviously, probably there is a thin line. Some of them are pretty much entertainers. And what I find it a bit insulting and a little bit disrespectful is the fact that also in a country like Uganda, Ugandans have gone through a lot. And I think so it is dangerous when some of these foreign artists come on board and actually trying to whitewash what has happened. I think there has to be a recognition of what is going on. And that's very important. What you have seen over the years is that you have seen that dictators, whether from the right or from the left or from wherever they come from, they are very clever in terms of actually, as I mentioned earlier, of co-opting artists into their cause. So that is something that probably we expect to go on. But just to wrap up, I think for artists, I have my contract had to be terminated simply because I probably did not toe the line, so to speak. And because of the political pressure that was there. And I must add that, I wasn't alone at that time. There were a number of other journalists and artists that faced a similar situation. And so I paid the price, and that is something that artists have also to face up to. There is a price to pay to such when you confront such issues, as you said, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, fella Nicola Bokuti paid with a heavy price, far more than many of us. He lost his mother. He was jailed, and that I think is across the board in Africa. So there has to be that understanding that yes, there is always a price to pay.
Thank you very much. Mantate, you have a follow-up for him?
Definitely. So I think what you talk about, in terms of the cost of socially conscious musing is something that we see in places like Zimbabwe, for instance. I remember that last year, part of what happened during the Zimbabwean Lives Matter campaign was that we had a lot of artists from outside actually putting out bold statements about the need for government in Zimbabwe to respect human rights. So you discover that people they got to a point where they had to question their own local artists to say, where are your voices when you're having the AKAs in South Africa, the Ice Cubes in the United States actually coming in to speak for you? So there's this notion of, trying to keep the hustle clean so that, you keep your income, because a lot of those young people are also unemployed. But also, just as a follow-up question, what I wanted to then come in to ask you, because you've mentioned that this is a course that is almost inevitable because you chose this path. But I think coming in to say there's a lot of younger artists that are coming up with a guy called Sasha, featured in one of the Resistance Bureau videos in the lead to this program. And these are young people that look up to, to the senior artists that we have, people like Gado, yourself. So my question is, how do we, get back to those young people, find ways of inspiring them into the struggle, but in a way, that can make them believe that there's some form of, I can't say an incentive per se, but we want to show them that there is change, that comes with what you're doing. But if they're seeing a lot of people kind of throwing in the towel or all of this happening to the artists, so how do we teach that to our younger generation?
I think quickly, just to add to that, I think for me, one of the things that I've done, and it has worked pretty well with what I do. I mean, but I also, be careful with this, is that number one, I stay pretty much very far away from politicians. But then my craft allows me to do that. So in a way, I can, work from my space here, and even when I used to have an office in a newspaper, I don't interact with this with politicians, and I've always argued, young people, is that that is one way of actually probably keeping politicians at arm's length, because they're interesting creatures, these guys, and so you don't know what they come up with. Now, many journalists, interact with them. You have to interview them. You have writers have to meet them, and so forth. And it's a little bit trickier, than my situation. But I think that is probably that gives an insight to probably how you can deal with it. I think that is one thing that actually young artists can look up to in terms of actually in their dealings. Because before you know it, that they're inviting you to some of these events, and they are you get gigs to perform and so forth. So it is important to draw a line and so forth. I've spoken to a number of artists. Probably we've come to seek an advice from me about their interactions, and most of the time I've tried to urge them that to try to draw a line. Now, I also must add, at a personal level, I have been very much tempted many times, whereby whether it is I should take this job or that job, and at a personal level, and even at the organizational level. I'm a co-founder of Buni Media here. We've actually evaluated everything, and I have actually very much avoided certain engagements simply because I thought I would put myself into some disrepute. So that's something that young people needs to look up to.
Thank you so much, Gado. I want to bring in DJ Switch into the conversation, because in a lot of African countries, like we've been saying, Uganda, Zimbabwe, a lot of artists are falling victim to captured judicial systems that attempt to stifle their expression. And this is particularly interesting for me because in a lot of those countries, art has always, art as a tool of resistance has always been regarded as relatively safer, than most of this conventional civic and political activism. So now looking at Nigeria, for instance, how is art as a tool for resistance being viewed by authorities today? And if we project a continued criminalization of art by aggressive regimes, what do you think should be done to kind of push back on this?
Okay, so thank you for having me, everyone. So let me put it this way, the way I see it, right? It's not just about the art, as we've been saying, it's also about the artist, okay? We talk about Fela so highly, all over the world because he was his art. You couldn't separate Fela from his music, his lifestyle, his conscious music, he lived it. And so we knew who he was. Today, what we have is lots of people that quickly jump into trending issues. All right. So the NSARS movement, for example, was a really hot topic at some point, right? And then you could see how people sort of walked away from it when it no longer became, it was no longer a hot topic, and so it's more like face value as I see it, the art that we, the social justice fighters, singing about injustice, corruption. I'd like to cite one person in particular, say Burna Boy, for example. That's someone that I admire a lot. And recently he won a Grammy, right? He's had some very powerful songs, of late that speaks to injustice, that speaks to tyranny, and winning a Grammy as well, there is a huge spotlight on him, but recently, just like what we're saying, he was invited to River State by the governor they wanted to honor him as they should. But the question is, with what? You understand? What was the attitude around the governor? What was the attitude in the state? How did the governor behave? And things like that. There were a lot of people that felt somewhat betrayed because, you're someone who, you have such a powerful voice and in your work. And then if you do something like this, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to say? So a lot of our art and our artists, there's this face value to it. My wish would be, you have to make a choice that if you're going to even touch on social subjects, you should be ready to stand by your work as an artist. Because art, like Gado was saying, these people know what they're doing. Okay, if they come and organize a concert and all of that stuff, you're now in their presence, they give you some bag of money, it becomes more and more difficult for you to stand up against these people. They know exactly what they are doing. So I wish that if you don't make the choice and you're just an artist doing your thing, please, by all means, I don't have a problem with anyone. But I feel like if you're going to go down that road, you must live your work. And that to me is the art of resistance, really.
So you're basically saying artists should count the costs before they start criticizing the government so they can stand by it.
Absolutely.
So I have a follow-up question. A lot of artists who are doing this, a lot of artists who are speaking out against the government or against the authority, sometimes they will tell you that it's lonely up there because not many people want to identify with them for criticizing the government. Although sometimes people would write them privately to let them know that they admire what they're doing, but they don't want to identify with them publicly. And we're just wondering, what has your experience been like since Lekki Gate, since the ENSA protest, since the shooting at Lekki Toll Gate? Have you ever been advised by other artists to keep quiet or to lay low, or do you feel supported by other artists?
I have been advised, and it's from a place of love. I know, just keep quiet, just so that these people forget you. I've also been encouraged. True, it is lonely, but like I and Jeffrey were talking earlier, this is why we have things like these. You understand, meeting people like you, and the rest of this beautiful cast here, which I plan to, get your details and, just to follow up how you guys doing. Let's build a relationship. It's important, okay? So that you don't feel so alone. And there's so many organizations across the world that help artists, all right? after that incident, I'm not going to lie, I think it messed me up a little bit, like in my head. But, you know, I've been able to, thankfully, you know, work my way out of it, because it's not easy, you know, just from a mental state. But I've had the time to sit down and think about it. And that's why I said, at the end of the day, it's a choice, right? What other people think about me does not even faze me for 1 second. All right. Just a few days ago, there was this trend and this issue resulting from so the US had done a 2020 country human rights participation report, where they vaguely worded a few things. And of course, propaganda machines and all their state-sponsored actors, they jumped on something that was really, to be honest, simple, plain English, right? You know, I may not quote exactly, but I'm going to say as best as I can remember. They said, you know, at year's end, they couldn't verify how many people had died. Okay, Amnesty had reported 10 people. Some other organizations had not come back particularly to say, okay, we could verify that as well. The government, so you see, when they say the government disputed this fact, they were referring to the Nigerian government. But, you know, a lot of us, you know, and I and Jeff, we talked about this, said, you know, I think it's a global thing. A lot of people don't have the time to read, short attention span. You understand? So they took that, spun it around, and then here I was. But I wasn't fazed because I know what I saw. You don't defend. The truth does not need defense. And so with art is the only way you can, if art is the truest form of speaking your truth, and I say your truth, right, may not necessarily be the truth. You understand? So if you're speaking your truth with art, it's usually short. Take music, for example, or take like a cartoonist. They could do two small boxes like you see on Twitter these days. And once you see it, you've gotten the picture. But we must do something about it. So I've chosen to do this, right? Come what may. It's just a decision. You understand? And as soon as I can get to a safer environment, I'm going to also start putting out some works. If you don't mind, I'd like to I'm seeing a question here for me. How much of the problem that artists face is about lacking a solid income from their art?
That's for you to answer later. You
Okay.
have time.
All right.
You have time.
Cool.
But thank you so much for that. Like, seriously, a lot of people don't think about the fact that it could be lonely up there. Some people, to be honest with you, some people will tell you, oh, she's just doing this for attention, or she's sponsored by the West. I mean, I hear it all. So
I've seen all of that. I've seen that. I mean, look at this. If you're talking about sponsorship, right? I mean, that's why I said sometimes we have to use our heads, okay? Wouldn't it have made more sense? Like if this was some sort of sponsored, why am I here? I'd be living lavishly in my hometown. You understand what I'm saying? Why am I here? And if it's money issue, it was on the table. I'm not interested in that. It's never been me. And anyone that knows me, if you look at my history, I've never been one that chases clout. You barely hear I barely talk. I barely post stuff. I have days in between when I post something and next thing. Even when I've posted my events where I've gone back and even deleted what I posted because I'm not really that great with social media. So if I'm chasing some sort of clout, to what benefit? I am so uncomfortable. You understand what I mean? It is such an uncomfortable choice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have coconut head, so here I am.
When the country needed you, you stood up to the challenge, and we're so grateful for you. So it's so nice to hear you affirm this, that sometimes that it could be lonely up there. That's something that a lot of people don't know. And it's been life-changing for you. Like you said, you've had to leave Nigeria and it's not something you didn't plan, and here you are, you know. So I'm going to go real quick to Lebo Mashile. And I just wanted to say that, first of all, you have performed spoken word in 28 countries. That's amazing. Like, huge kudos to you, my sister. But I just have a few questions. Have you seen a pattern in the way that art is used to challenge injustice across the countries that you've been in? And what would you say are the avenues for cross-border collaboration, you know, among all the artists? And sorry that it's 3 questions, but the third question is, what's the role of artists around the world to help African artists in amplifying their voices so that as they speak truth to human rights violations, the rest of the world would also echo what the African artists are saying. So it's 3 quick questions. Is there a pattern in all the countries you've been? How can all these artists have a cross-border collaboration? And artists that are not in Africa, how can they help to echo what the artists in Africa are saying?
Thank you for those questions, and thank you for having me on this show. It's incredible to be in this company. I feel less alone listening to everybody's responses. and this is the pattern, is that, you know, the more we interact with each other, the interesting thing about COVID is that if you're on this side of the digital divide, where you have access to these kinds of conversations, borders have been collapsed. So in the last year, so I found myself having more interactions with African creatives on the continent and in the diaspora, and finding out that we actually experience similar issues, particularly those of us who care about social justice. Last year, the conversation convened a panel around Africa Day with a number of African creatives from around the world. And Blitz Bazauli, who worked on Beyonce's Black is King, was in that forum. And he was saying that one of the challenges that we face as African creatives right now is the fact that we're working in countries that don't have institutions that support the arts. So we are forced to become our own institutions. So you have to make the work, right? You have to live a creative life, which is challenging enough. The process of making work, of innovating, of remaining creatively fresh and relevant is challenging in and of itself. Then you have to do that in an environment that doesn't support your politics. If you care about social justice, meaning if you care about being pro-Black, pro-African, pro-women, anti-homophobic, you know, if you care about the values of being, anti-elitism, if you care about being anti-capitalist, then it means that you are working against the status quo. You know, we're working in countries where our governments are corrupt. So even if there is a Department of Arts and Culture, like there is in South Africa, the money is being eaten by the very same people who should be funding the work that you should be doing, who should be enabling the creativity in your country. Instead, they're not, you know. Right now, there's a protest that's been taking place at the National Arts Council. For the last 35 days, artists led by Sibongile Mngoma have taken over the offices of the National Arts Council, one of the major funders for the arts. Why? Because 300 million in money that was supposed to go to artists for COVID relief is unaccounted for, has been eaten by the government, essentially. So artists have been staging a sit-in in Johannesburg, South Africa for the last 35 days. They've used that as an opportunity to bring public art back into a cultural space that was once one of our most vibrant cultural hubs, Newtown, in the center of Johannesburg, that was killed due to gentrification. Spaces like that were spaces that created me, you know? So, I mean, when we talk about how do we build the arts, how do we strengthen the arts, we need public spaces that make the arts accessible to our people. We need those spaces in rural communities, in urban communities. We need those spaces all over the continent, within walking distance of every human being. Spaces where you can go and listen to a reading, or listen to music, or learn about traditional dance, or, you know, take an art class, see an exhibition, but places that make culture accessible to people. Once the spaces and the platforms exist, artists will populate those spaces. We know what to do, you know? The interesting thing about us, I think, as the other pattern that I see is that artists know when artists are not hindered by either political agendas or are hindered by capitalism putting a stranglehold on our survival and, you know, inter alia, our voices. Artists know how to make work. We know how to create jobs for ourselves. We know how to plug in the gaps. We know how to use our voices, whatever they are, painting, dancing, DJing, making music, writing. We know how to create the products that our people need, you know? But when you cut off that pipeline between the artists and the people, then you put a stranglehold on the artists. So this is what many, one of the patterns that I see is that in our own countries, whether you are living and working in the country of your birth or whether you're in the diaspora because of the politics in the country of your birth, there is this stranglehold that you have to overcome. It's interesting though, because COVID is creating these opportunities for us to be able to have these dialogues. I mean, if you think about it, you know, we could have all met, but it might have taken a decade for us to meet. meet, right? But now, because we are in this world where we're all stuck in the house and we're relying on technology to connect us to each other, we're finding that borders are collapsing. We're finding that it's easier to connect to like-minded people. We're finding that it's easier to see the commonalities between artists who are engaged in a creative life and in a life of struggle, you know? And I think that's gonna make it possible for us to be able to collaborate further, to collaborate in political ways, you know, also to collaborate in creative ways, like to make work together, you know? I think, kind of, what was the last question? The one was collaboration across borders. The last one I forgot.
Artists, foreign artists.
Oh,
they can have to echo what the African artists are saying.
I mean, I think what a platform like this is a wonderful example, you know? I mean, you have people who have assisted to convene this conversation sitting in Washington, D.C., but the people who are controlling this conversation right now are Africans, are African women, you know? So I think that's the way to do it, you know, is right now, the spotlight of the world is on the continent, and it is going to be for generations to come, because, I mean, there are a billion, as a continent, there are a billion of us. The vast majority of us are under the age of 30, not myself included, but the continent certainly is. It means that the future of the planet is here. Europe is aging. Other continents are their populations are getting older. That's why it's becoming so intensely important for even global superstars to invest in ensuring that they are on the minds, top of mind for young Africans in terms of their cultural output and products. It's very important for US superstars to make sure that 18-year-olds on the continent know them. That means that they have a future. So the gaze of the world is on us. I think the West can help to facilitate these kinds of conversations by using their resources to enable platforms and then handing over the mic, you know? Also, the West can deliberately make an effort to communicate with creatives who are actually living on the continent, you know? In the West, it's very possible to have an African arts festival and have that festival just be Africans in the diaspora. And I don't say that to invalidate the identities of Africans who are in the diaspora, because that is also a legitimate, you know, that's a legitimate African experience. But if you have a festival in London, an African arts festival that's populated only by artists who are Africans based in Europe, you lose out on the experience, on the challenges, on the possibilities that exist on the continent right now, you know? Many times I feel like we who are living and working here are often overlooked, because there's this idea that, you know, we still suffer from these colonial hangovers, you know, the ideas that there is no development here, there is no infrastructure here. Where would I even start to reach out to artists on the continent? What's happening on the continent? We're here. We're organized and we're mobilized in our own structures, you know? Come and find us in our communities. Come and find our work online. We are there. We're in those spaces. We're on social media. And I mean, it might be a little bit harder. We might not be organized into the big bodies and structures that you're used to, you know, in the West or in more developed parts of the world. But once you enter our communities, it's very easy to find us, you know? In fact, there are fewer barriers to access in Africa than there are in the West, you know? So I think being conscious, deliberate, and intentional about who you choose to amplify when you collaborate. And I also say that about us as South Africans, you know, because I understand that we also have a very toxic footprint on the continent as well, with our own colonial and apartheid baggage of xenophobia and all these other issues that we are wrestling with and struggling with, you know. The onus is on us equally as South Africans to make a deliberate effort to collaborate with other artists from the continent and to amplify those voices, because we have an infrastructure that allows us and enables us to do that. And also to look at our own stuff, you know, in the process, to be able to name our own toxicities and our own demons while we call out those who are also oppressing us.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to say real quick that I really love how you opened. DJ Switch has talked about how it could be lonely up there, but you did say that we actually do have a community. Sometimes we just have to find it. You know, there are actually people of like mind who are doing what we're doing in different African countries. So, and with technology, like you said, we can always reach out to others. There are people who are doing the same thing that we're doing. And I've been fortunate, especially to network. And that's what I wanted to say, that I think the most important thing for African artists is to network, especially when you feel lonely, when you feel like not many people are happy with what I'm doing. Just try to find, even if it's in another country. Like one of my best friends is Farida Nabarema from Togo, you know, because we're like-minded. We're talking about the same issues. And so it's about networking. I think that's the most important thing. And also, no man is an island. Even with artists that are not in Africa, you have to network. During the NSAS protests, people like Rihanna tweeted about it. So many American celebrities tweeted about it. And it's because of the network that they have, people, Nigerians who have networked with them. So thank you so much for saying that. And I'm sure Mantate will have a follow-up question for you.
Definitely, Adiola. You speak so passionately, Level, and it's inspiring to, you know, see a woman, a Black woman, you know, amplifying the blight and also just the opportunities that are available for artists in the continent. And I think one of the things that I took away from what you said was the issue of, you know, cultural access, making culture more accessible. Because I think in a lot of our countries, particularly, I'll give you an example of Zimbabwean communities where it almost feels like a luxury to get into a gallery and see an exhibition, but it shouldn't be the case. We should make culture more accessible, art more accessible, so that a lot more young people, a lot more older people can actually find their voice in their art as well, and then contribute to the broader, you know, fight for democracy and human rights in the continent. So my question really centers around the question of, you know, has the arts provided a platform and voice for minority groups and marginalized voices in general, including women, persons with disabilities, and the LGBTIQA community, for instance? Like, what has been the result and impact of this expression, particularly looking at those demographics?
Oh, I mean, I think we come on the backs of generations and generations of artists who have struggled against a number of intersecting oppressive forces. You know, if we look at just the struggle against patriarchy, you know, you look at writers like Nawal El-Sadawi or Buche Emechita or Zizi Dangaremba or Bessie Head or Yvonne Vera. I mean, people have been writing about with the complexity of living in a Black body that moves through society simultaneously while living in a woman's body that moves through society, and what happens when the two of those meet. And the backlash for both is equally strong. You know, Black people will get your back when you're fighting about Blackness, but not everybody will get your back. Particularly Black men won't get your back when you're fighting about feminism, you know, and that's a battle that we're taking on head on right now on the continent. Similarly with homophobia, you know, many people, their progressive politics stop at the point of when it comes to aligning with gay people, with queer people, with differently abled bodies. And this is where this I think is really the challenge of our time right now, is how to get all of these struggles to unite, you know, to see that a person who is marginalized because of if a person being marginalized because of their disability, you know, is just as much my struggle as a person being marginalized because they happen to have a womb that gives birth to children, you know. And because we come from societies that have conditioned us and socialized us in particular ways, you know, the power of the arts is to allow for complexity to enter the realm of the imagination and to disrupt what is there in a way that is truthful if it is doing its job, right? So we need for all of our people to have access to the arts, because the arts make us critical thinking. The arts open up our imaginations. The arts make us broader in our approach to life and to problem solving. So no matter what it is is that you do. If you're an engineer and you're exposed to the arts, you're going to be a better engineer. If you're a parent and you're exposed to the arts, you're going to be a better mother, a better father, a better caregiver. If you are a scientist and you're exposed to the arts, you're going to be better at what you do. This is why, you know, the right to arts and culture is enshrined in the Constitution. It's a human right. I mean, the creation of art is one of the defining cornerstones of the establishment of a civilization. We know that human beings are civilized when they are able to produce art and culture, when they're able to use their creativity to try to make sense of and respond to their world, you know? So when you deny this to a people, you're denying them the ability to process, you're denying them the ability to think critically, you're denying them the ability to see mirrors of themselves, you know? And this is deliberate. I don't think we should pretend that this is by accident, you know? This is one of the things that got overlooked, unfortunately, in our post-liberation landscape. It is deliberate. Why would it be in the interests of the powerful forces who oppress us to have critically thinking, creative, self-reflexive, organized Black people on this continent? Why? That would actually empower us. It would empower us from the inside out, you know? So the people who are denying us access to art and culture are the very same people who benefit from us being stunted and broken. And this is what makes this protest, this public protest that's happening in South Africa at the moment, so interesting. It's artists claiming public space and using it to give art to the people. This protest has given birth to one of the best public arts festivals that I have seen in like more than 20 years of working as an artist in South Africa. It's currently happening in 4 cities in South Africa, you know, but the longest running protest is here in Johannesburg. And every day there is public art being performed. That space has been converted into a gallery. Why shouldn't this happen in every city, in every village, in our continent? Why shouldn't there be a spaces that are taken over by creativity? Ours is, we don't have bullets, we don't have guns, we're not interested in that. That's not our project. Our project is to create and to make our creativity accessible to people, because we understand that when we inject that energy into the society, the ripple effect of it is healthy and healing and productive. So why would you want to stop that unless you are actively interested in stunting people's growth and development?
Thank you so much, Level. I could go on. I definitely love this conversation, but I now have to turn over to our colleague, Nick Chisman, and our guest discussant, Sue Williamson, to get their thoughts on this topic and also to check in on our WhatsApp channel to see what questions we've managed to receive from our audience today. So Nick, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Mentari. It's been a really inspiring conversation so far, and you've inspired many questions from our audience. For our speakers, I've put those questions in the chat. So if you want to get a head start and start thinking about your answers, they're in the chat for you now. I'm going to put them to you in just a minute. But before then, I'm really delighted that we get to come to Sue Williamson, who's joining us from her studio in South Africa, an important writer and artist who also wrote the book Resistance Art in South Africa. And Sue, I think, is a really important person to bring into the conversation at this point, because on the one hand, she can tell us a really positive success story of the role that art has played in the fight for freedom in South Africa. But also because, you know, having written a really important book herself, she's really done interesting in-depth research on this topic. So Sue, over to you. We'd just love to hear from your perspective, you know, the sort of slightly more historical perspective here, and how you see the situation as perhaps changing since that struggle against apartheid and the role that art played in it.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's been a real, am I on video?
Yes, you're on. You're fine.
Oh, okay. It's been a real pleasure for me to listen to all my colleagues from around Africa and to see how common the problems are, in fact, the difficulties that artists have in making their work and getting their voices heard, in avoiding being co-opted by politicians, and in trying to keep their work authentic. I think those are the themes that I heard the most. And I've been thinking a lot about the way that we operated in the 1980s, and if there's anything that I can share from those days. And to go back a little bit historically, a very important thing that happened was in July 1982, there was a conference which was held in Gaborone in Botswana, and it was entitled Art Towards Social Development and Change. And it was organized by a group called Medu Art Project. They were printing a lot of anti-apartheid posters and distributing them across South Africa. And the theme was culture and resistance. And it had it as its aim, encouraging cultural workers to be part and parcel of the communities from which they came. In other words, everybody had a social responsibility to bring about change and to empower others to do so through creativity. And the old hierarchy of art school trained artists was not important. Those who had had that training, who'd had that privilege, had the responsibility to help others. So it was a case of each one teach one. And there were very important artist groups formed. There was the Artists Alliance in Johannesburg and the Visual Arts Group in Cape Town, and other groups in the other disciplines as well. And we really worked together to do so many different things, taking exhibitions into community halls in the townships, helping trade unions, printing posters and T-shirts, designing things for groups, often printing them behind closed doors. And the sort of the power of all that it was just trying to get information out all the time. There were groups in Soweto, young people, not related to these particular groups that I'm talking about, but they formed the Peace Parks movement. And at a time when the residents were withholding their municipal rates because they thought service delivery was bad, the young people said, well, the rubbish isn't being collected, so we're going to clean it up ourselves. And they literally cleaned up the streets, painted stones, made little parks, used trash to build sculptures, and they called them peace parks. So there was this feeling throughout the country that we all had to do something. And it's, of course, once we had freedom, I think this sort of national urge sort of fell away a bit. It was a bit like, oh, well, we've won now and we can relax. But of course we haven't won, because things go on all the time. There are new problems. Lebo has been spelling them out very, very clearly. The new government, I'm afraid there are many problems with corruption. This 300 million is just one of many corruption stories, which is quite horrifying. And we have to go on working together. We have to organize and we have to work together as groups, I think. But I think the important thing that came to me, the important points were avoiding being corrupted by politicians and keeping your voice authentic and not trying to divide, talking about Fela Kuti, which his name came up a lot, about how living his life as he did as an artist and as a completely authentic person, that's what gave his work validity. You can't make political work to please anybody and then run and take money from politicians. It has to be a unified thing. And I think Africa has enormous potential to share this message with the world.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a set of questions now of our speakers, including Sue, and then I'm going to come to all of you in turn for responses. We are going to run a long time, so I'm going to ask you to keep the responses to these questions short if you can, to make sure that we can get through everyone. So Sue, my question for you is that, I think at times in the past, South Africa and South African art has been seen, a bit like South Africa itself, is sometimes said to be exceptional. And do you think that there's been enough work to connect South Africa to the rest of the continent and to sort of draw on those lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle and share them more broadly? Has that been done enough? Comrade Fatso, how is the situation now for artists post-Mugabe? This is someone, we had this question in two different formats from people in Southern Africa who are watching. Have we seen any significant changes? Are you less worried about speaking out under Mnangagwa than you were under Mugabe? If there have been changes, what kind of effects have they led to? DJ Switch, this is a question that a number of people have touched on, which relates to finance. How much of a problem is it that artists don't really often have a solid income, that in some cases their art is often pirated and they don't necessarily benefit financially from the popularity of their releases? And this makes them perhaps more vulnerable or amenable to co-optation by those in power. Is this fundamentally a sort of finance problem, and we need to resolve that before we can expect artists to be more resistant to those in authority? This is to Gado. Gado, satire is something that was used in the one-party state to poke fun at those in power. often because using satire made you a bit safer from reprisals. So a couple of questions that have come in, one from America, one from East Africa, are basically asking you, is satire as important today as it was then? In the multi-party era, can we attack people more vociferously? Do we need satire in the way that we did in the 1980s? And Lebo, finally coming to you, can you say more about how we can use art to unite people? So this is a question that's come in from South Africa, but also a couple of other countries. Unite people across ethnic lines, across ages, and across races. And someone's in particular asked us, this is especially something they wanted to ask in cases where perhaps older generations are less supportive of political protest or radical political change. So I'm going to come to Sue first and ask about those connections between South Africa and the rest of the continent. And then I'll come to you all in the order the questions are in the chat. So Sue, over to you.
Well, the strange thing is that all the money comes from the north, so that South Africans tend to be invited to shows in Europe and the United States, but not that often in the rest of Africa. And I think that's a shame. It's because of money, of course, that South Africa and the rest of Africa don't have the institutions which can fund large exhibitions. But we do have, I mean, Zanele Maholi at the moment has a massive show at the Tate, which is fantastic. And I think South African artists are reaching out, but of course, we are still right at the bottom of the continent, and there's not the same kind of exposure that one gets if one's living right in the center in Europe or the United States. So I think I would encourage, as Lebu said, if you go onto people's social media, you'll find out much more about them. And I would encourage people around the world who are interested in what the artists of Africa, all over Africa, are doing. They should just have a look. I started a website called Art Club. Right.
No, go for it. Please get people to go to your website. Go for it. I
was just saying that in 1997, I started a website called Art Throb. It's www.artthrob.co.za. It's still going, and it covers contemporary South African art, and we often cover other countries as well. So, and the archives go all the way back to 1997. So you'll find a lot of material there for anybody who's interested.
Brilliant, thank you. And I would encourage all of our speakers to please do plug your websites, your social media, because it is the way that we can make these connections. Over to you, Comrade Fatsa. Have we seen things really shift since the Mugabe era?
No. I mean, you know, in one word, no, comrade, no. But to elaborate, you know, in Zimbabwe, we've got a saying that we have freedom of expression, we just don't have freedom after expression. Because you can say what you want, you just don't know when you get off stage if the guys in dark glasses are going to be coming for you. And I think that's the situation now with, you know, with ED, as we call him, with Mnangagwa. You know, he took over from Mugabe. Ultimately, this guy, you know, Mugabe, Bob, as we called him, Bob was the teacher and Mnangagwa was the student. And he's really, I think he learned the worst from Bob. He came in, you know, on the back of a coup in 2017. He was saying Zimbabwe is open for business. This is the new dispensation. But very quickly after that, I think you saw 2018 with the elections, you saw, you saw the murder of protesters just after the elections. You saw creeping attacks on protesters after that, attacks on journalists. And in terms of artists, you've seen the abductions of artists, of political satirists, of Zimbabwe dancehall artists who are outspoken against the government. And this is something we didn't even see under the Mugabe regime. So there's, you know, a fantastic outspoken satirist called Gonyet, a really amazing young woman. And she was abducted and forced to drink sewage because she did a skit about police violence. We had the Zim dancehall artist, Platinum Prince, who did a song to the president and was abducted and beaten by masked men. So no, change hasn't happened under Mnangagwa. But I think, you know, where the hope lies is with your young creators and your young content creators. who are working in incredibly difficult circumstances with new laws coming into place. We've just got the patriotic bill they're trying to push through that will criminalize dissent. We've just had an activist locked up for 36 months for blowing a whistle for inciting violence. And you've got young creatives and young artists who are the ones who actually represent hope in Zimbabwe. Young content creators that you'll see online, producing really amazing skits. So the likes of Gonyet and Bus Stop TV, who are, 2 weeks after she had been abducted, she was back putting out political skits, speaking truth to power. You've got others like Simuka Comedy, who do skits of the president himself. We've just put out a brand new web series about police corruption. It's Zimbabwe's first mockumentary set in a police station, all about police corruption. And so I think for us, it's really about trying to change the system using the power of art and everything that we've got at our disposal.
Thanks so much. Okay, going over to DJ Switch and bringing that question about finance to you. This is part of the problem that so many artists don't actually financially benefit from what they produce, and that encourages cooptation that many of you have talked about today.
Thanks. I could answer this question in so many different ways, but I'm just going to say as bluntly as I can. I think it really comes down to character, because if you want to talk about finance, all right, things have changed so drastically now, with streaming services and what have you, that you can see a lot of our artists are well-to-do. They're well off, okay? And it's not like the older days where, your big jobs came from government officials and stuff like that. And then coupled with the piracy, it's hard to say, for example, I'm going to depend solely on the sales of my album or something like that. And so that's, again, I keep going back to Fela, but that's why it even makes it all the more important, what he did and his work. But I will not say that is now the problem today, okay? There's so many ways artists get paid today. So it comes down to character. And that's why the first example I gave earlier of someone who I admire so much, from his work and everything, he's a Grammy Award winner, he's a big boy, he has money, right? Now, imagine someone like that turning down this whole thing. Imagine he came out publicly and he said, look, why don't you attend to the people you've been owing salaries for months? Or why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? I want you to picture the response. I want you to picture the impact it would have had on Nigerians. You understand what I'm saying? Because from that move alone, even other artists, right, will not in any way, you see people fall in line and act that way, because somebody else will want to be the one to say, this guy turned down this money, I'm going to go take the money. You'll be roasted alive. So I wouldn't say it's finance completely, right? Today, I would even say it's greed today, okay? Because the truth is, there's so many ways money can be made today. Thank goodness for this platform. You've got social media, you've got all of that. Streaming services alone, the amount of money that is being raked in for streaming alone, it's insane. So I will say the truth on this issue. What I believe is it's no longer about, piracy. We need the money, we do this, we do that. I just think it's dependent on the person's character and greed.
Thank you very much. A powerful statement. Gado, we're coming to you now on the question about satire. Is satire as essential as it ever was? Is it less relevant now? Now we're in a supposedly democratic era, although Comrade Fatso has pointed out to us that, of course, perhaps our current era is not as democratic as we might hope it to be. But over to you. Where do you see the role of satire in countries like Kenya and Tanzania today?
Thank you, Nick. Good to see you. Before I actually jump onto that one, I would like to, mention that listening to Lebo Mashile earlier on was like listening to somebody from Nairobi, Kenya, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, or Kampala. When she talked about reclaiming the art spaces, it's really, really important. And more importantly, also, is that we see this marginalization even in the about the arts, even in the realm of policymaking. And so the problem is even much more complicated when it comes it is actually embedded even in our policies. But back to your question, is that yes, satire is ever more important than even before. I think satire has that ability to morph and actually find relevance. That's also very important. I think the challenge for me becomes, especially in these parts of the world, is how do we protect the gains that we have had in the last number of years. So if you are to look at the East Africa, for example, is the challenge is that we've had this back and forth in terms of freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and so forth, and that's huge. So satire remains as relevant as it was, and we have seen, for example, now, I mean, there is actually fairly, one can say, in Kenya and East Africa as a whole, you have actually the media that has been captured. Is one can fairly say that it is captive to the political elites, and it has made matters worse. And therefore, platforms like this become ever increasingly more important because the stuff that you find that the stuff that that you probably would have been aired probably 5 years ago is fairly difficult now to be aired by the mainstream media. So that shows you how important today satire is. But one good example is I like to give about this is I look at the US and the Trump era, and sometimes I kind of say that we tend to pick wrong lessons from US, and just to use my craft, is that who would have thought actually in the United States today that political cartoonists would be fired simply for criticizing Donald Trump, and this this happened to a country that has a democracy or history of democracy of over 200 years. And so it is always important to take that perspective and be very careful. And as we move forward, especially for young satirists and many of us, is also how do you increasingly guard against the gains that you have gained, especially in this ever-changing world that we are living with social media and so forth and so forth. And again, I repeat, I mean, the politicians all the time, they never sleep. They are constantly working, organizing, and trying to scheme here and there. And that is something that we are seeing every day, whether it's in the United States, whether it is in Africa, or whether it is actually in China. Thank you.
Absolutely. And just to add a second thought to that, I'm channeling some great research being done by a friend of mine, Laura Martin. I think the humor also has another role to play, right, in that it can be important as a kind of healing process and a coping mechanism. Yeah. It's important to be able to laugh at those in power who are repressing you. It's important sometimes to be able to turn that pen back. And I know, Garo, that some of your cartoons have enraged people because they've highlighted certain issues of them, but they've also done so in a way that has mass resonance. And I think that's something that often humor can do in a way that, a damning political critique simply couldn't. That healing power of humor is something that we overlook, but Laura's work is really starting to bring out its significance, including in conflict context. So I think you're completely right about the continued relevance of satire and of comedy more broadly. Over to you now, Lebo, to bring us home. Your question was about how art can be used to unify people, and in particular to bring in perhaps older generations who may be less supportive of political change.
This question made me think of the Fees Must Fall protests, which took place in South Africa in 2015, which actually were born out of a call to remove the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. Fees Must Fall started as Rhodes Must Fall, and then morphed into Fees Must Fall, which became this intersectional protest around not just the cancellation of fees, but also the improvement of workers' rights. And it brought to the fore a call for decolonization of university campuses, but in broader society that we are seeing the ripple effects of now. And one of the things that became apparent during Fees Must Fall was a generational rift, because the protest rippled out, and I mean the creative community also, we found ourselves, having to decide, well, are you for it, are you against it? And there was a generational divide, and we saw the older generation seem very reluctant to support this movement, that they saw, the destruction of campuses as kind of hooliganism. They didn't understand it. And what became really interesting is that I participated in 2 literature festivals during that year, Time of the Writer and Abantu Festival, both of which have a strong Pan-African ethos, both of which are deliberate and intentional in their centering of African narratives. And using those platforms to have conversations about decolonization, conversations about intersectionality and what it means, led to a shift in some writers, not all writers, but some writers of the older generation around what Fees Must Fall actually was, So I think, having said that, we suffer from a crisis of memory in South Africa. It's also one of the patterns, to kind of come back to Adeola's initial question that she posed to me. It's one of the patterns that I also see on the continent. And it is a trauma that is born out of colonization, really. I mean, the history of this country, according to our textbook, begins in 1652. There are buildings in Europe that are older than that, So what does that mean in terms of memory? I mean, if you are living in China and you can go back thousands and thousands of years and look at your own history, but you're in South Africa and the history that you're learning only begins with the worst trauma experienced by your ancestors, how does your perspective of the world, what does it look like when your memory is truncated and defined by trauma? And then, I mean, of course, the history that we learn also is a history that's written from the perspective of our colonizers and our oppressors. Now, recently, in the last generation, the history of resistance has been incorporated into the curriculum. But again, as a young person growing up in this society, which is the most unequal society on earth, the money that you pay to go to school is the indicator of what quality of history you are going to learn and carry with you as a human being, which is fundamentally wrong, So, I mean, we have a crisis of memory. And I think that is a direct role that artists can play, and not just artists, but broader, the broader term creatives, which includes healers, which includes academics, which includes philosophers and thinkers, but people who can help us to repiece this memory together. If we repiece our memory together, as if we think about memory as a tapestry, that each of us has a thread in that tapestry, then we can use tools that we have at our disposal to repiece that memory together, to weave it together again, and to do so being cognizant of the fact that we live in incredibly diverse societies. So, I mean, what I would like to see, I think a lot about the programs that were implemented by Roosevelt after the Great Depression. One of the programs that he did was inviting artists to go, writers, out of work writers, to go into the Deep South. I mean, of course, it was white writers, because this would have been the 40s, in the United States. So white writers were invited to go into the Deep South and capture the narratives in audio and also written of the last surviving slaves, right? People who had been born into slavery. So, I mean, this was was in like the 1930s, 1940s in the United States. The people who would have had a living memory of slavery would have been between kind of 70 and 90. This became the slave archives, which are held at the Smithsonian. You can go and log on right now and listen to the living testimonies of what life under slavery was like, coming from Black mouths. You know, these are the kind of public works projects that we need on this continent. We need to be sending young people with their command of technology, young people who understand these devices better than anybody we should be empowering young people to use these devices to recapture memory, to reharness the memories of our communities, of our families. I mean, starting with, you know, creating family trees. How did our story on this continent is the story of forced removal, of migration, of being shifted from one place to another because of political forces. In the middle of that, families get broken, stories get lost. You know, the repiecing together of family narratives becomes the beginning point of healing kind of national and narratives across borders as well, you know? So I would love to see technology being used as a way of being able to create intergenerational conversations and also to harness the stories of the generations who are leaving us. It's unfortunate as well that, you know, this pandemic has come and has made our elders on this continent even more vulnerable than they already are, you know? I think as we think about that, as we think about the very real threat and possibility of losing that tier of elders, you know, we must think about the stories that go with them, the language that goes with them, the stories of resistance that go with them. People have been resisting colonialism, slavery, apartheid in whatever version, in every country where these forces of oppression manifested themselves. There are stories of resistance that have not been captured. Capturing those stories empowers us. It also empowers the older generation to realize that their contribution to this history matters, because our elders, their resistance, their radicalism also has been erased, and that diminishes us too.
Well, I know that a lot of funders who are interested in these kind of issues are watching us right now. So let's put out a pitch for some funding to conduct a project on histories of resistance, collecting oral histories in exactly the way that you just said. I think it's a brilliant idea. I know of some small projects that are doing it, but not on the kind of scale that you're talking about. I think it's an inspiring vision for how we could connect different generations and keep those stories alive. So you've given us a vision. Let's throw that out there and let's see if that's something that we could do as part of our collaborative endeavors, because I think that's a great way of taking something concrete and positive out of this. And thank you to all of our guests who've been fantastic. I'm sending it back to Mentali now to close the show.
Thank you so much, Nick. This has been one of the most, inspiring episodes of the year. And I just want to say that we could go on, but that's all the time we have for today. So just a shout out to all our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you especially to our brilliant panel for joining us today. Our entire team looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you, as well as just tracking and highlighting your important work as we move forward. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with the Resistance Bureau by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and subscribing to our newsletter there. We also encourage you to follow us on our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and as well as on YouTube. So you just search for the Resistance Bureau. We really hope that you continue to join us in these important conversations that we'll have. But as a final note, putting this show together would not be possible if it wasn't for the teamwork that continues to bring it to life. So thank you so much to our advisory council, and a special shout out to our colleagues, Peter Dory, Jeffrey Smith, and Dondo Msaga. We're working very hard behind the scenes to make this show a success. For myself, Mandatum Lojwa, my co-host Adiola Fayahan, and the entire Resistance Bureau team, thank you so much for joining us. Stay winning.
Peace.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.